This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 874 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. On last week's episode, you heard Jim Sannes talk about the quarterback class. This week, we're on to running backs, and I brought on a special guest to help me navigate this year's class. Noah Hills quite literally focuses on the running back position. He looks at running backs on a deeper level than almost anyone on the planet over on his website, noahmoreparties.com. Noah and I chatted about running back data, his feel for this class, some of his favorites in the class, and more. You definitely don't want to miss his insight. And you'll hear that insight in just a second. First, I just want to remind you to sign up over on Underdog Fantasy. There are best ball drafts happening constantly over there, and I'm actively participating in them because it's a great way to not only have a good time, but to prepare for the fantasy football season. As I've been saying, I've got some big content plans this summer that relate to best ball. You won't want to miss out on that. So head over to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app and sign up. When you do, make sure you use promo code LATEROUND. That'll give you a deposit match up to $100. That's promo code LATEROUND. Now let's talk some running backs. All right, Noah, you've really dedicated a lot of time and energy to the running back position. What made you focus on that position in particular? And what's sort of your overall process like that you think sort of differentiates your work at the position?
Yeah, I think I was just kind of predisposed to being interested in running backs in general. I grew up on like the NFL films, like VHS tapes of like the greatest running backs, and I played running back in football when I was a kid. But also when I started like becoming interested in like writing in, you know, the fantasy football like adjacent space, I perceived like almost like a gap in data centric running back analysis, where so much of what was focused on really had nothing to do with how good players were at running the ball. Like speed score is an approximation of, you know, size and speed, obviously. And it's, you know, predictive and draft capital and, you know, dominator rating and target share, you know, these different measures that we kind of always use that are sort of like signals where we're sort of like feeling around in the dark about how good a player might be. And we do pretty good with those things. But none of it has anything to do with how good anybody is at running the ball. And so I really kind of focused there. And I think that kind of led to like kind of why my process is a little bit different. I have sort of like a film-based or a film-like approach to like the data side of the analysis, where I'm really looking for like traits and trying to like isolate and contextualize like on-field data as much as possible to be revealing of traits. Whether that's, you know, tackle breaking metrics or, you know, isolating things to how a running back performs in the open field, or, you know, kind of consistency versus efficiency being a signal for like, you know, stylistic differences in players. And I also think I have kind of a data centric approach to film analysis, where I have kind of inspired by, you know, like PFF or Matt Waldman. I've, you know, kind of systematized everything so I can chart things and derive metrics and data from the film that I'm watching. So yeah, I think that's kind of the approach. I kind of like a two-sided approach to a problem that I perceived, I guess.
Yeah. You know, one of the problems that I've had with running back data in particular through the years is that I think a lot of it is just like insanely descriptive, right? Like so much of it is, this is what happened under these circumstances, but we know that future circumstances are not necessarily like that. And it seems as though, and this is through a little bit of testing and stuff too, but it seems as though we don't really get that great of an idea of the kind of running back we're dealing with until we get a large enough sample size with some of the data that I'm speaking to here. And once you get a large enough sample size, not a lot of running backs are able to have that large of a sample size to begin with, right? Because their shelf life is so short in the league. And it's why I think that like a lot of times, and you could disagree with this or agree, but I'm curious on your thoughts on it. I feel like a lot of times, like in the dynasty community especially, people will lean into, oh, this guy was really good at breaking tackles in this one season, therefore you should trade for this player. I almost feel like just being simply contrarian is almost a winning strategy at the running back position, because those things are just being weighed a little bit too heavily, and we're not looking at necessarily the right data, the right things. Would you agree?
I think I both agree and disagree with some of what you're saying. I definitely think a lot of the things like breaking tackles, or whatever it happens to be that we're kind of like latching onto outside of gaining yards and scoring touchdowns, kind of whatever stylistic thing we've decided is a key, often is just descriptive. Like, it's, if you're breaking a ton of tackles without actually going down the field, like, it doesn't matter at all. But I also think with the descriptive nature of particularly efficiency is kind of like notoriously unstable, from the NFL or from college to the NFL or from situation to situation. And I think we can kind of try to do a better job by over expectation metrics are good. I think team relative metrics or contextualizing things with situational factors like box counts and offensive line play and defensive strength of schedule, and kind of bake all of these kind of external factors into, I don't know, creating situational baselines and expectations for players and seeing how they compare to those can help us, I think, analyze players cross situationally in ways that are more revealing than just like, what does 5 yards per carry at Alabama mean versus 6 yards per carry at Western Kentucky? Like, it's very hard to say. And I think I'm rambling a little bit and off the point you originally had, but I think, I agree and disagree, I think.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. I've been talking about that too at the wide receiver position, where, a lot of people look at like yards per team pass attempt and they make these apples to apples comparisons of a guy who went to Western Michigan versus a guy who went to Alabama. And it's just not logical to do that, right? I mean, we know that the guy who went to Western Michigan is not facing the same kind of defenses that the guy who went to Alabama did, or doesn't have the same competition within his team. And so being able to contextualize all that, definitely important. I just think that a lot of people are incapable and not able to necessarily do that with the tools that they have. And it's great that you are working on tools and doing things to be able to give that context. Let's talk about this year's class, because I think it's interesting in that, there's not a lot of obvious studs in the class, but there's also a lot of older backs in this class. There's 6 running backs that are going to be over 24 years old by the time the draft rolls around at the end of the month. We've only had 13 of those kinds of running backs since 2011, at least in my database, which looks at every back who was either at the combine or was drafted. So we don't see old running backs very often. Now we have 6 of them this year. With your process, does the age factor matter at all? Or are you just saying this dude can play ball, so I don't really care?
Yeah, I think I do care about things like declare ages and breakout ages insofar as they're like a proxy for talent as we're kind of feeling around with the data that we have. Like, obviously a guy who, gets on the field early it says something about his ability versus a guy who it took 3 or 4 years or whatever. But I do think for a couple reasons, like, I don't want to get carried away, especially with something like age, which I want to look at as kind of on a case-to-case basis. Like we've seen in recent years, guys like Travis Etienne or Najee Harris. I think Blake Corum kind of falls into this category. Like guys who were good enough to declare earlier, but for injury or, just because they wanted to play 4 years, they went back to school. That doesn't necessarily say anything bad about their games. But I think this class is somewhat unique. I mean, it's obviously unique given the numbers you just cited, but I think we're in an interesting kind of historical spot in college football where we have the residuals from guys who got an extra year because of COVID, and guys who are now being given extra years when they, or who are at least not having to waste years when they transfer, so they can play immediately and go back and forth with freedom. And now with the arrival of like the NIL system in college football, enticing players to stay more years than they otherwise would. I think we just are kind of in the midst of like a weird confluence of factors that results in a bunch of old guys declaring kind of all at the same time. But like I said, like I want to look at it on a case by case basis. A guy uh, like Cody Schrader's a decent example here. I think he was a 6-year guy. He's got to be pushing 24. And he started out at, some like junior college or something, kind of worked his way up and eventually played 2 years at Missouri. That says something, not definite, but it says something about his level of talent versus a guy who didn't play 6 years, like Corum again, as an example, who can clearly play or was clearly good enough to play early and good enough to declare earlier. And then there's the factor of like running backs don't last that long in the league anyway. So if you're coming into the league at 22 versus 24, shaving 1 year off the end of your prime isn't a huge deal in fantasy football terms, I guess. But
yeah, I'm wondering too, if at the end of the day, like, it's a bigger deal to some degree. Like you said, there's signal for age and stuff because we want more talented backs. And obviously if a back is coming out at 21 years old or something, there's going to be some embedded talent more than likely in that. But at the same time, I'm almost interested in like, Ray Davis, for instance, he's going to be over 24, by the time the NFL draft comes around. And I actually think his game is interesting. I think there's some interesting like production marks with Davis, but at the same time, it's like, is it a bigger deal for Davis himself than a fantasy manager? Because what that tells us is he's probably not going to get a second contract or at least a lucrative second contract, because no team is going to look at a 28-and-a-half-year-old after, his 4-year rookie deal is up and say, hey, we're going to give this guy, $5-8 million a year, which sucks for Davis, right? But from our perspective in fantasy, it might not be as big of a deal if you throw away the talent indicators that age might have. And so I like the idea of sort of just taking it case by case. And it might be an instance where some people just overrate it. And I'm with you that this is a very unique situation overall across all classes, not just at running back, in that, you have the COVID season, you have transfers really adding up and piling up. And then you also have the NIL stuff where I don't think we're going to see as many olds, if you will, as we are here in 2024 moving forward. I think we're going to see more, but I just think that like this storm, it was just perfect, right? For all of these older guys to really, really hit. Let's talk about this running back class at a higher level. I think the general consensus right now is that it's a weak running back class. Do you believe that? Do you think that it's sort of flat as well? Like there's not this like obvious RB1 elite talent. How are you feeling about the class in general?
Yeah, I think it's a deep class. I think it's definitely lacking elite, like top end, super elite talent at the top. Like there's no Bijan Robinson, there's no Breece Hall, there's no Jahmyr Gibbs or, Devon Achane. We don't have any of those guys, but like, I think this class is pretty stacked with like second and third tier prospects that like the same level of like a Zach Charbonnet level guy at the top through like a Tyler Algier type prospect, like that kind of range. This class is loaded with those guys. Matt Waldman just released his rookie scouting portfolio. I took a look at that to kind of, check my work against his almost.
Sure.
And in his top 36 running backs of the last 3 years, kind of his combined class rankings, 13 of them are from this class, despite none of the top 5 being from this class. So
yeah,
that's a fine ratio. That's actually one player disproportionate to this season represented there, despite the class not having any top 5 guys, according to Waldman, which I think is, probably a pretty reasonable take. Right. And I feel largely the same way. Like there's not a ton of elite talent at the top, but definitely Zach Charbonnet level guys at the top of this class, as well as, maybe 10 to a dozen guys who I expect to be role players in the NFL.
Yeah. And, like those kinds of role players, they will have opportunity eventually. Some of them will, to step in and be fantasy relevant in some way. Right now, according to NFL Mock Draft Database, Trey Benson is listed as the RB1 in this class. It's been pretty consistent since the combine over there when looking at how mock drafts are sort of stacking up. Do you agree? And then do you have any sort of concerns or fears about Benson's game? I kind of like poking holes in that way, like looking at red flags as opposed to just saying, yeah, this guy's great. I want to start out by saying this guy's good, but what are the problems with that player?
Sure. Yeah. And I'm a reformed hater of fast running backs who like make bad decisions. So I definitely have some bad things to say about Trey Benson.
Nice, yes.
I don't agree. Well, I won't say I don't agree. I don't have him at RB1 myself, but he is part of a group of guys who, like, if in 3 years' time he's produced like this class's RB1, I won't be surprised at all. Like he's fully capable of that. The fears that I have with his game are like I said, he's really fast. He's really athletic. He's always going to have the kind of like big play juice, the athleticism, the like tackle breaking ability that's going to earn him opportunities. Like he's not going to be a guy that just can't find his way onto the field. The worry, I think, in the same way that it's kind of like varyingly affected guys like Travis Etienne, Kenneth Walker, DeAndre Swift, Miles Sanders, either in kind of like wearing out their welcome with coaching staffs or coaching staffs feeling obligated to like supplement them with somebody who can, be a little bit more consistent on the ground, is Benson has a tendency to like bounce runs or miss holes or just like do kind of questionable things at the line of scrimmage in search for big plays, or maybe because he doesn't know what he's looking at, or he's, kind of decided what he's going to do pre-snap and just does it. Whatever the reason, he often is not one of the best decision makers at the line of scrimmage in this class. Sometimes he gets away with it because he's super athletic and can break tackles and jump over people and whatever. But I think this has affected like Kenneth Walker to a certain extent in Seattle, where he'll make, a strange decision. Sometimes he'll be able to pull it off, sometimes not. DeAndre Swift, coaches have become frustrated with him for things like this. So those are the fears that I have with his game. But if he ends up in a gap heavy scheme where he's not having to make a ton of decisions, or he just, lands somewhere with a coaching staff who's willing to put up with those things, or if he just grows, there's no reason why he couldn't be a stud.
Yeah. The top comp that my model spit out for him was Kenyon Drake, which I think makes a lot of sense based on what you're saying there. The other thing, I do think that his analytical, like some people look at his analytical profile and they're kind of like enthusiastic about it and excited about it. I think a lot of that probably has to do with like the size speed combo that we saw from him at the combine in particular. But if you look at, I have a metric called breakout score, which just tells you how well a player had age-adjusted production in terms of total yards per team play by just using that metric. And then also it looks at reception share, best season reception share. Trey Benson was under a 10% best season reception share, and he was under a 60 breakout score. And if you look at day 2 running backs, assuming he goes day 2, since 2011, who were under those marks, you get Alex Green, Stephen Ridley, Kristen Michael, Carlos Hyde, Matt Jones, Damian Harris, and Trey Sermon. Right? It's scary, man. Like there's a lot of fear to this profile, whereas I think a lot of people are just automatically making him their RB1, feeling good about it, because I do think, to your point, like I do think that it can be put together. I just think that there's a lot of just general red flags, surrounding his profile. One guy who I think a lot of people, don't necessarily see as many on-field red flags or some off-the-field red flags with his injury because he has that ACL is Jonathan Brooks. What's your eval with him?
I really like Jonathan Brooks. I am a little perplexed that people don't care about the ACL.
Me too, man.
Seemingly at all. I understand it's 2024. I understand that guys regularly recover from these things, but very often not in year one. Blake Corum is being, he's receiving all this criticism for being much worse in last season than he had been previously. He had a knee injury and, was recovering from surgery and was much worse. Jonathan Brooks could very easily experience the same thing. But that aside, I'm a big fan of Brooks. I think he's the best outside zone runner in this class, in particular, and I think he's maybe the most well-rounded running back in the class in general. The one maybe significant beef I have with his game is that he does not run with a ton of power, and I think that kind of really limits him as an interior runner specifically. I think from a decision-making standpoint and, vision and just the cerebral aspects of his game, I think he's fine running on the inside, but he's a little bit skinny. I know he showed up to the combine at like 215, I think, but he didn't run. So I
Right,
don't know
exactly. That his weight was like, oh, you have ACL weight right now. You're just hanging out. You know, you're lifting. You're not running on this. You're not burning a bunch of calories with cardio. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And he's been listed at like what 6', 6'1", like 207.
Right.
I think last season. So he's a relatively skinny running back, and he runs high. So he's pretty liable to getting cut down at the knees, or he doesn't do a great job of getting his pads low. So he often goes down easily. So that's my big beef with his game. But he's super smooth, kind of in the same way that like Jahmyr Gibbs or Zach Evans just sort of glides up the field. Jonathan Brooks does kind of the same thing. I think he's a good route runner. I'm not the pass protection guy, but people seem to like him in pass pro. So I think he's a 3-down back who, especially in an outside zone scheme, could be really good. I see like Aaron Jones comps. I think he's kind of similar to Tony Pollard. He's definitely a good player.
Yeah, and look, he's one of those players where if you're looking at things through data, you have to give that data a lot of context because he played behind one of the best prospects that we've seen over the last decade in Bijan, but also Roshan, right? Like Roshan Johnson was there too. So, you can't look at his total body of work only from a production standpoint and, look at that the same way that you would look at someone else who had a more wide open opportunity. I think the ACL point is so key, at the very least from a game theory perspective, like in fantasy, right? It's like if you're planning on drafting Jonathan Brooks in your rookie draft, which may or may not end up being the right call, I do think that you have to at least understand that year one could be rough. And if year one is rough, you're then going to have to evaluate what you're going to do with Jonathan Brooks entering year two. And even if you know in the back of your head that ACL is there and that's the reason he didn't perform, the way that he should have performed, you're still going to have some doubt, like that still is going to exist. So I think there is a lot of volatility because of the ACL. And then obviously his draft capital might suffer a little bit because of that ACL as well. You brought up Blake Corum a few times. I'd say he's being pegged as sort of a solid but not super high ceiling back in this class. But I did see that he's your RB1, and I'm curious, is that because you see him as sort of one of the safer prospects in this class, or do you really see a high ceiling with him?
Yeah, I do definitely see him as a safe prospect. He's just so good. Like he's just like the quintessential what you want your running back to be at the line of scrimmage in terms of making decisions and being patient and manipulating defenders out of position. I had a tweet a few months ago that said something like, if there was like a magic line that showed the perfect, the most optimal path that a running back could take on a given play, Blake Corum's actual path would follow that line like 95%. It would right. He's just always where he needs to be. So I think that gives him a pretty high floor. Like even if he is never the same guy, post this injury, I think he's Myles Gaskin. Like he's a guy who's going to be capable of shouldering a workload and like not screwing up on the field, and coaches can put him on the field because of that. But if he is healthy, I do see a high ceiling. I don't think he doesn't have like a Bijan Robinson or like a David Johnson ceiling where he's going to do everything.
Right.
But he has high end traits. The things I just described about his vision and his decision making are, I think, elite. Like he's very good in those areas. He's also quick. He's very laterally quick. He might be the most like explosive side to side running back in this class. And he's a great short yardage runner. He's able to get small. He runs with power because he stays low. And I think he has great. This is a completely fuzzy thing to reference, but I think it matters in a similar way that like draft capital does. He has good football character. He's got a high football IQ. He's one of these workout warriors. He's just one of these like rough football guys that coaches love and want their daughters to date. So I think that stuff helps. And if he's able to, if he's truly healthy, which I think he will be. I wrote an article about meniscus recovery. I did a bunch of research like a month ago. So I'd point to that on my website. But if he's healthy, his high end outcomes are like Devontae Freeman, Aaron Jones, Ray Rice. Like I think there's precedent for a guy who's not super fast, not super big, but who can just run the ball well and be dependable. being productive in real life and in fantasy.
Do you see his receiving profile as strong enough, or strong, or maybe a weakness?
Yeah, I don't think it's as strong as like Aaron Jones is. I don't think he's ever going to be like a guy that coaches are throwing up the sideline on wheel routes and things like that.
Right.
But I think, again, I'm not the pass pro guy. He seems okay to me in pass pro. He's got the body for it. And I also think he catches the ball well at the very least. Like I don't think he's a great, downfield route runner. He's not a guy that you're going to kind of scheme up in the passing game really, but screens, check downs, like I think he's, completely adequate in the passing game.
Right. Another player that I saw you were high on, which was kind of a surprise to me because I feel like people, especially after the combine, have gone in the opposite direction with Audric Estime. Does his slower, straight line speed, what we saw with the 40, does that concern you at all? And then I know I wrote in the show sheet, it's not like we haven't seen, slow weight adjusted 40 times from Notre Dame running backs in the past, but is there any concern about that and how he tested, or do you just say, screw it, I know what I'm seeing and I like Estime?
Yeah, this one's been tough for me because when I watch film, I don't try to, create expectations for how like fast a guy is or what's his 40 time going to look like. I just kind of, watch their decision making and, tackle breaking ability and then kind of fill in the gaps of their athleticism later. But there are also, videos on Twitter from the Real Sports Analytics account that has Estime at, almost 21 miles an hour in the open field, which isn't incredibly fast, but it's also not extraordinarily slow.
Mm-hmm.
And, however you feel about pro day 40s, he was a little bit faster at his pro day. There are also guys who, if we just look at his 40 time from the combine and his splits from that 40, he wasn't extraordinarily slow compared to some other running backs in his archetype, like Jordan Howard, Alfred Morris, Josh Jacobs, Mark Ingram, Ramondre Stevenson, these kind of, 215 pound, 220 plus pound running backs who are mostly two down backs, which I think is mostly what Estime is, but I do think he can play on third down. But I think his main draw is he's, a big kind of thumper on the inside. And I don't think his speed disqualifies him from being successful at the next level. Like, it's not something I'm crossing him off my board for. I mean, clearly I have him at RB3, but I do think it does limit his ceiling. But he is of a play style and compares, I think, reasonably well to other guys in that archetype who've been successful in recent years that I think he could do it as well. Like if Jonathan Brooks and Blake Corum are not the best pure runners in this class, I think it's Estime. Like he's that good in the other aspects of running the ball, outside of being able to, pull away deep in the open field. I think he's that good in the other areas of playing running back that I'm still very much interested.
Yeah, look, this is why this running back class, even though it is weaker at the top, there's not that elite back like we were talking about earlier. This is why it's kind of a fun one, though, because you can have a guy like Estime at RB3, and it makes sense because of that flatness and that just kind of large group of guys that you could kind of interchange and move around and shift around at the top. So I get it. Pre-combine, I definitely was interested in Estime. I agree with you that, at least from an analytical perspective, the receiving profile isn't totally there. That's probably the biggest worry. And it's not so much with these guys that they would be incapable of playing that role. It's just how a team might deploy them, right? We have to worry about that and think about that from a fantasy perspective. Braylon Allen, he's got to be the weirdest prospect in this class, at least to me, because analytically, man, his age-adjusted production absolutely ridiculous because he enters college early. He's 17 years old playing at Wisconsin, and he's getting the rock a lot, and he's producing a lot. But that was kind of the ceiling that we saw. There wasn't that much improvement on the production front throughout his collegiate career. There's also some issues with how he was able to force missed tackles given his size. Just a lot of that going on, some funkiness. My model likes him just because of the age-adjusted production, but I have more subjective concerns. Do you have concerns with Braylon Allen as well?
Yeah, I do. He's also the hardest guy for me to get a good grasp on, at least, kind of with the big names in this class.
Mm-hmm.
But kind of the concerns that I have almost seem not the same as what a lot of other people have, especially people who like, are into watching film, which has kind of surprised me. I think he's a little bit underrated in his ability as like, I guess like a thinking man's runner. Like if you separate, what he's able to do athletically and kind of what he looks like physically, kind of the way that he navigates the line of scrimmage. He came to Wisconsin as like a safety / linebacker and ended up playing running back as, a 14-year-old boy or whatever it was. And he's, but he's also huge and athletic. So it's like, you have this picture in your mind of like a guy who doesn't really know what he's doing, but is just dominant because he's big and fast. And that's kind of true, but I also don't think he's like notably more mistake prone at the line of scrimmage than a lot of other guys who've, been playing running back and are in this class. But I do think the like manifestation of his physical skills and like his athleticism is just so inconsistent. It's like maddeningly so. Mm-hmm. Like at sometimes I watch him and it's, man, his footwork is so clean, and the way that he can transition from like running laterally to cutting up field is so nice, and he can fit into these tight creases. And there are times when he gets the ball out in the flat and will just throw a dead leg. And against Illinois, there was a play where he did that, and the guy just completely whiffed and kind of crumbled to the ground. And like there are these flashes of just like special ability, especially for his size. But then there are other times when he looks like 2023 AJ Dillon out there,
right?
Where it's like, how are you not moving quicker in the back? It's like he's running in sludge in the backfield sometimes. And he does run with a disappointing level of power relative to like how big and strong and fast he, apparently is based on his, Instagram or whatever.
Yeah, right.
But
right.
And so it's like, how can you not? It's kind of like playing pickup basketball with like a dude who's like 6'4", but like he plays in the post, but he fades away every shot. It's like, dude, just go up strong. And that's kind of like what playing with, or what evaluating Braylon Allen is like. So I'm kind of in and out. Like he's just so hot and cold. That he's hard to get a good grasp on, but I do see a high ceiling, and I also see an outcome where he just can't play.
Yeah, right. I've kind of approached it with Allen as I'm going to let the NFL decide for me. I'm just going to see where he ends up going and kind of evaluate from there, because again, analytically within the stuff that I'm looking at, he probably has the best looking analytical profile in the class because of the age adjusted stuff. Is it elite? No. Is it above average? Yes, for sure. I'd call it good to great, right? But all of this, like all the secondary numbers and all the stuff that folks who are looking at this stuff, more than I am, while watching, I'm seeing it too. I'm watching as well, but I'm not charting and looking at things the way that you would be. It's scary, man. I mean, it just seems like there's a wide range of outcomes, for Allen. So I'm just like, you know what? Let's just let the NFL take the wheel here and choose for me. One more player who is definitely, he's got a hive, man. I mean, he's got people that are very much on him. I think DJ right now, Daniel Jeremiah, has Marshawn Lloyd as his RB1 in this class. And so I'm curious where you're at with Lloyd.
Yeah, I've kind of always been a Lloyd guy, but I find myself in recent weeks, as I kind of think about him more and try to reconcile my enthusiasm for him with my kind of tentativeness with Trey Benson. I find myself a little bit more wary, but I am in on Lloyd. Like he's good. He's 220 pounds. I don't think he plays at that, but he ran 4.46 at that. So, I mean, that's pretty good. He's super elusive. He's one of the like more like elastic movers in the class. And he can attack defenses as like a downfield receiver. Like he was used quite a bit. I mean, he wasn't used quite a bit, but when he was used, it was often downfield and on, wheel routes and routes up the seam. He can make tough catches. But he, like I said, he has some of those same like bounce happy tendencies as Trey Benson, where he's always kind of searching for a big play and abandoned structure when he shouldn't. And he's a complete mess on like inside zone runs. Like he's just all over the place, like running into blockers and bailing on holes to go chase something else. Like he's a mess there. And he has a pretty significant ball security problem. And if that does not get fixed, I envision him being incredibly frustrating to have on the field, and a guy that it might just be like the juice might just not be worth the squeeze if he's going to fumble every 2 games.
Yeah.
But overall, I think he's somewhere on like the Duke Johnson, DeAndre Swift, David Johnson spectrum, where like none of these guys are super natural runners from like a cerebral standpoint, but all of them are really athletic. All of them can kind of, attack defenses in the passing game. It just kind of depends on how much can you figure out like the finer points of, not making a ton of frustrating decisions and not fumbling. It will kind of determine how successful Marshawn Lloyd is in the NFL, I think.
Yeah, I mean, he's another one similar to Trey Benson where analytically there's just some questions that I have. I wrote this in the prospect guide where since 2011 we've had 27 drafted running backs enter the league past the age of 23 with a breakout score below 40. So Lloyd's score is 31, so it's well below that 40 mark. Just 3 of the 27 backs had double-digit PPR point per game seasons during their first 3 years in the league, and those 3 players were Andre Ellington, Latavius Murray, and Buck Allen. So, Latavius Murray obviously had a decent career, but the other 2 kind of fizzled out fairly quickly. They weren't big league-winning backs. I feel like he's one of those players where I don't know if he'd be getting the steam he's getting if not for the class that he's in, like if it were, last year or the year before even where you at least have that very obvious RB1 or an RB1 and a strong RB2, I don't know if he would be there, but I do think that it's scary when you totally fade a super athletic back. I think that there's some fear there, and that's what we would be getting both with Benson and Lloyd. Just there are flaws there, but I don't know if completely fading would be the right idea. All right, so we've talked about the higher end guys in this class. Give me a couple backs that we haven't talked about that you might that you think that fantasy managers should at least have on their radars.
Yeah, I'll give you 3. The first one, just real quick, is Mayan Williams out of Ohio State. He was awful last year, and I don't have an explanation for why. But prior to that, you get these guys posting these charts of like explosive run rate and tackle breaking, and Mayan Williams is always like way in the top right corner by himself. Like he's one of the best missed tackles forced guys according to PFF like ever. And he's kind of like a Dameon Pierce type runner to me, where or Javonte Williams, this kind of archetype of just runs super hard.
Yeah.
So I like Mayan Williams as like a super late dart throw. Kamani Vidal is another guy who runs really hard and he's like just under 5'8", 213 pounds. Also ran sub 4.5. I didn't see that speed on film, but I mean he's got that athletic ability somewhere. He did well in the jumps and the agility drills. He's kind of a full skill set athletic guy in a very compact frame. And he runs like it. Like he gets low, where Jonathan Brooks does not do that. Kamani Vidal is often horizontal on the field, just like plowing through people, bouncing off people, dragging people for extra yards. He caught 92 passes. He's got some of that Blake Corum to his film, where he's just able to read, press to the line of scrimmage, manipulate somebody out of position, and then hit a hole. Just kind of very blue collar in his approach to the line of scrimmage. He's a little clunky. I don't think his tape matches his agility score, especially. He's a little clunky in kind of changing directions behind the line of scrimmage, but he's an absolute load to tackle, and I think he knows what he's doing behind the line of scrimmage. So he's definitely one that's fun. And then the last one I'll say is Will Shipley, who I expected to not like on film really at all. Like his data just kind of was uninspiring to me. But I'm kind of willing to chalk it up to a bad situation at Clemson, where the offensive line was a mess and they just kind of things just didn't really go well. It's just kind of dysfunctional. But Shipley is one of the better like route runners and receivers in this class. He's natural, over the middle of the field and catching balls out of his frame. And he's also like a Marshawn Lloyd type of athlete, but who knows what he's doing, like as far as making decisions at the line of scrimmage. I think he's got a lack of power that is going to limit him as an inside runner, but if he can get on the field on third downs, which I think I think he can also contribute against like lighter box counts. So he's a guy who I think is pretty exciting as like a satellite back with the decision-making ability and kind of experience as a full-time rusher to, maybe graduate into a 3-down role, kind of like Austin Eckler, in the same way that Austin Eckler was kind of an underqualified bell cow, but an overqualified, like just kind of pure third down guy who found himself in like this voluminous role. I think Will Shipley, I wouldn't predict Austin Eckler level fantasy numbers for him, but I think he's got a similar skill set and could kind of handle similar responsibilities.
Noah, that was great. Really appreciate your time, man. For anyone not following Noah and his work, make sure you change that and look up at Noah More Parties on Twitter and check out his running back work over on noahmoreparties.com. As usual, you can find me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. And make sure you're checking out the Late Round Prospect Guide, which is live and ready for consumption by heading to lateround.com. You'll get the updated version of that guide the weekend of the draft. I try to get it out to you guys as soon as I can because I know you have rookie drafts immediately following the draft. Thanks for listening, though, everyone. I've got a Late Round Perspectives episode for you later this week, and I'm really excited for it. I'll talk to you then.